Well, hello, welcome everyone. So happy to have a great group here today for our newest IDP webinar on the changing student perceptions of the United States as a study destination. We'll just give folks a moment to log in and join us. I want to say good afternoon to all of you joining us from North America. Good evening and perhaps even good morning for those of you joining us in other time zones. For those that don't know me, my name is Jessica Sandberg, and I joined IDP just this past March as Vice President of External Affairs in the United States. And it is truly my privilege to join IDP in this new position, which is really all about sharing data and insights and thought leadership across the sector to advance the field of international education in the United States. I'm joined by my colleagues, Ellie Butler, who is the Director of Marketing in the US for IDP, and will be joining us in just a moment to share some of the survey's findings. And also, you won't see today, we're joined by Emma and Carolyn behind the scenes, who will be helping get this webinar off the ground. And yeah, on your screen now, I'll mention that we're also very fortunate to have two industry experts that will be joining us for the panel portion of today's webinar. We're joined by Beth Kennedy, editor at The PIE News. I know many of us rely heavily on the PIE for policy updates, especially in this time where things are changing so rapidly. And as Beth's responsibility is to keep an eye on international education globally, I think her perspective is going to be quite valuable to us. And then many of you know Kalpin Trivedi, who is Vice Provost of Global Affairs at University of Massachusetts Amherst, and we're very proud to say is also a member of the US Strategic Advisory Board at IDP. So we're always very, very happy to have his insights. So before we dive into today's data, I wanted to just make note of a few details about today's session. First of all, the session is being recorded. So for those of you coming from different time zones, just be assured that we will be sending the recording, a link to the recording, as well as slides in a follow-up email. Next, I wanted to mention that we will have time for some audience Q&A, so please make use of the Q&A function in this webinar. It should be an icon at the bottom of your screen, and I encourage you to use that rather than the chat for your questions so we can keep track of those. We'll do our best to answer as many as we can in the time that we have available today. And one quick disclaimer is that this survey that we're going to share with you today is quite rich in content and data. And so we're not going to be able to cover every iteration of the survey. But again, we'll do our best to answer questions that you have. And then please do pay attention to that follow-up where the report that we will send you will have a little bit more detail for you to dive into. Looking at our agenda today, I will just take a moment in subsequent slides to try to bring us to the present and provide a little context for the survey that we're going to share. Again, reflecting this very unusual and volatile moment that we're in our field. I'll then turn it over to Ellie Butler to walk us through the findings of that survey. And then in the second half of today's session, we will have a panel discussion with Beth and Kalpin and also address some of those audience questions. Next slide, please. So let me take a moment to explain a little bit about IDP. Now, I have worked in the field for, I think it's 25 years now, and I've attended countless webinars. And I know that sometimes when we get to the slide about the host, whether that's a company or a university, this is the part where we often tend to tune out. And so let me tell you why I think it's important to tune in here just for a moment. Because when we share data and insights from IDP, I think it's really important for you to know where that data is sourced and where it's coming from. So IDP has just a massive global footprint. We have more than 200 student counseling offices around the world in 35 different countries. And to put that into context, we placed more than 100,000 students in universities around the world last year. On top of that, we run more than 2,000 test center locations, and that is because we co-own the IELTS English language exam. And then weaving that all together is our online suite of platforms, and collectively those receive more than 100 million visits a year. So this is the environment and the footprint that we tap into when we survey students and we report out data. This is really a pretty broad and well-distributed slice of the global student audiences that everyone here is trying to reach. And lastly, I'll say that IDP has been at this for a very long time. We're founded in 1969 and perhaps not as well known in the US as some of the other destination countries. But again, IDP has weathered a lot of storms when it comes to policy, economics, and of course, the global pandemic. So deep experience in navigating these changes and adapting accordingly. So that's the backdrop from which we provide some of this data today. Next slide, please. So important to note why we conducted this survey. And the first reason is that it is part of our commitment to track international student perceptions. And why do we do that? First and foremost, because we are trying to support the students in our programs. We want to ensure that we're supporting their academic journey and ultimately their dreams for academic success. And then secondly, as I mentioned, especially as part of the External Affairs Division, we aim to share this data out with the field to support the advancement of international education. And for my purposes, that is specific to the United States. So this is part of our commitment. And I'll share with you that we aim this year to continue to track student perceptions on a quarterly basis. We'll be conducting student perception surveys in one form or another. So stay plugged in because we will continue to track perceptions as they shift. Secondly, we ran similar surveys back in October before the presidential election in the United States, and then in February just following the inauguration. So we're looking to track shifts during this very changeable time. For those that followed our earlier survey that was released in February, many of us were very surprised by the results, which indicated that just over half of students we surveyed reported that they had a more positive view of the United States following the inauguration of Donald Trump into his second term. And then lastly, as we all know, because we're living it, the pace of policy and procedural change is very, very rapid. And so it's important we understand in serving students and serving the field that we keep a finger on the pulse. Next slide, please. So fear not, I will not be reading this slide, but I wanted to illustrate for all of us just the incredible volume and pacing of changes to our field since January. Again, I mentioned I've been in the field for over 20 years. I don't think there has been any period in my time since about 2000, the year 2000, that we have seen this volume or speed of changes, even in a whole 4-year presidential term, let alone a 6-month period. So if you're feeling overwhelmed or disoriented, you know, we're looking at this, we're very zoomed into it day to day. But when you take a step back and you look at it, it's considerable. And so again, part of our commitment to the field is doing our part to navigate this, to analyze this, and provide the data that we have. Next, please. So I wanted to provide, some quick takeaways right up front. We're going to spend most of our time today looking at the short-term view. The survey that we're sharing today is a survey of students that are already in the counseling process. These are students that have indicated the US as a possible area, a possible interest for their destination, and they are in the process working with counselors. Some have already applied. Some may even hold offers. So we're really talking about students in the 2025 or early 2026 enrollment timeline. And what we find with this group, as you'll see in the subsequent slides, is that they do have concerns, and some of them are significant. But for the most part, most of them are still planning to proceed. They're invested in the process at this point. When we look further out, and we won't be spending as much time on this today, but I did want to put that disclaimer out. that when we look further out, when we tap into data sets available to us for students at the top of the funnel that are just starting the process, we see much more volatility, and we see that perceptions of the US are more vulnerable. So these are important notes for you to take as you think about recruitment strategy and planning in the further out term, the 26-27 timetable. Next slide, please. Here's a very busy slide, but this is a quick snapshot of what we are seeing for that longer term view. I mentioned the traffic that we have in our online platforms. This is a 1-year view of weekly search activity across our platforms, looking at the share of search activity across the 4 top destinations. That's the United States in the blue line, the UK is the orange line, Australia is the yellow line, and Canada is the red line. On the left-hand side of this chart, that represents the last half of 2024. You see a fairly stable picture with the US in first position. When you look at the right-hand side of this chart, that is the last 6 months, give or take. And you see not only a lot more volatility, but you also see the US has dropped pretty significantly into second position behind the UK. Now, we've added in here some time posts or mile markers to show where specific events have happened in recent months. We think what we're seeing here is real-time shifts in perception in response to those policy or procedural announcements. And again, this is the group that's further out that is probably more impressionable. So again, this is the group we're not going to spend much time on today, but I did want to share this little bit of a snapshot so that we understand the overall chronology of the student journey and how they're being impacted by changes in the United States right now. Next, please. Okay, so now we'll dive into the student survey. Again, this is a survey conducted in May of students, international students in our network who have indicated an interest in studying in the United States. One important thing to note about the survey and how it was conducted is that it was in the field between May 12th and 22nd. Now, we rushed to get this survey out because of all the change happening in the field, but many of you who've been paying close attention will know that there's some significant developments have taken place since May 22nd. Notably, the student visa appointment pause took place in late May, and the escalation of threats against Harvard's ability to enroll international students, as well as the travel ban. Those have all taken place since May 22nd. So you want to bear that in mind as you look at the results. However, I do think that there is very important and actionable information in these results, especially as we look at the trend lines of student perceptions and we ask them about specific policy changes and their impressions of those. And again, we will continue to poll students, so we will have the opportunity to track these changes as we go forward. Next, please. So here's a look at the respondent profile, and you can see here a pretty good breakdown overall in the gender identification, the status of where students are in their admissions journey, and then their study level specifically. And next, please. And then here's a look at the countries of origin. This is typical for IDP. It reflects the locations where we operate globally. And I think it's also a pretty good match with the countries that dominate international student enrollment in the United States. So I suspect that this data will be meaningful for many of you that are overseeing international student recruitment strategies in your institutions. Okay, and then with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ellie Butler to walk us through the findings of this survey now that we've provided a little bit of context. So over to you, Ellie.
All right. Thank you so much, Jessica. And hello, everyone. It is such a pleasure to have you with us all on this webinar. I see so many familiar names on our attendee list right now. So hello to all of our friends and IDP partners. It's great to have you with us. And I'll now be diving into the core of the survey responses. So we'll start first here with this section on perceptions of the US as a study destination. Next slide, please. There we go. So we first asked students, how do you perceive the US as a study destination? And I want to be clear that we asked this question before any reference to the current political state. So this is just asking students how they view the US as a study destination in general. And students could answer on a scale from 1 to 10. And we see here that the overall perceptions of the US as a place to study are still quite high, particularly in Kenya and Nigeria coming in the highest. Now, I'll call your attention to the fact that China in the second column here is quite a bit lower than every other country here. So while everyone else rates the US 8.5 and up, China rated it a 6.4. And this is consistent with what we saw in our January-February pulse survey. And you will see this theme come through a bit more today as well in other questions. So I want to ask you to keep your eye on China as we go throughout this. On the next slide, we asked students which factors contribute to their perceptions of the US. And here we see students responded with quality of education, availability of scholarships and financial aid, and opportunities for research and innovation as their top 3 responses. And it's worth noting here that quality of education comes through consistently in our surveys when we ask students why they choose the US. This is not always the case for the other destination countries, but consistently for the US, quality of education is always chosen first. So I think that is something we can really hang our hats on and be proud of. Now, as we know, over the past few years, there has been a trend of students applying to more institutions in more destinations. So we wanted to understand where else these students were applying, and students could select all that apply. Now, I saw while Jessica was speaking that we had a question come in our Q&A box, and it was Anna Bradford, who very wisely pointed out that it might be time to stop talking about the Big 4 destinations and start talking about the Big 10. So shout out to Anna for alluding to this. But yes, this slide is very clearly showing that students are really hedging their bets. So we'll first take a meta view here, and I will call your attention to the fact that the orange or salmon bars, which is this most recent May survey, is almost across the board higher than the blue bars, which represent that January-February survey, in every column except for only US. So that only US column are those students who were only applying to institutions in the US. They were committed. And as we can see, that number has dropped from the January-February survey to now, while every other destination has grown. So really, students are hedging their bets. They're applying to multiple destinations outside of the US. So then looking at specific countries, we'll start over on the left here, where we can see that the UK and Canada, sorry, back one slide, Emma. We can see that the UK and Canada are where students are most often applying to besides the US. Those are both tied at 36% of students. So I think that's quite remarkable that over a third of respondents are applying to one or both of these destinations in addition to the US. This is then followed by Australia and several other destinations down the line, including, as you can see here, Germany, New Zealand, France, and so on. So now we'll take a look at that same question by source country. And here we have the top 4 responding source countries to the survey. But what I want to call your attention to here is that US only line. So again, these are the students who are only applying to US institutions. And we can see that nearly half of all Indian student respondents are only applying to the US, the highest percentage of any source country. Now, when we compare that to China right next to it, we can see that students are really hedging their bets in China, applying to multiple different destinations. Only 11% of Chinese students are applying to the US only. So quite a different picture across different source countries. So moving on, we will now take a look at how students view the US specifically through the lens of the current geopolitical climate. So we asked students, how has your perception of the US changed since President Trump took office? And again, here we are comparing student responses from the January-February survey to this most recent May survey. And what we see overall is that positive student sentiment toward the US has declined over the past 3 months. you can see here that the percentage of students saying that they have a worse perception has increased. So that is just taking a look at the red boxes on the left. Here, the percentage of students saying they have a worse perception of the US since Trump took office has decreased. Whereas here in the middle, you see those students who are reporting a better perception of the US worse has increased, better has decreased. And then roughly the same number of students say that their perceptions have remained the same as before Trump took office. Now, obviously, we can see here that green in the middle, the largest proportion of students still say that they have a better perception of the US following Trump taking office, but that number is starting to decrease since our last survey. So definitely some softening perceptions of the US among these students. Now, when we take a look at this same question, but we break the responses down by gender, we can see that the biggest change in perception actually took place among males. So back in our January-February survey, we saw that the majority of males reported a better perception of the US under Trump, while less than half of females reported the same. But now if we look just at this reddish box here on the left, so this is the percentage of students who are saying that they now have worsened perceptions of the US. That has increased for both males and females. And in the center here, looking at the proportion of students who say that their perceptions of the US are better under Trump, those are decreasing, and especially so for males here. So we can see that the largest jump was for males. Obviously, their number was higher to begin with, so they had farther to fall back. But yes, we see both genders here seeing shifts and worsening perceptions. We then asked students, how has your perception of the US changed since President Trump took office? And this was on a sliding scale, with 10 being much better and 0 being much worse. So I will again call your attention to China here, where we are seeing the most negative perceptions at 4.4 out of 10. We then see a lot of other countries hovering around the middle of this sliding scale, around 5 or 6. And then Kenya here is really the standout for highest perceptions. So we can see here Kenya with 7.6 out of 10. So next we will take a look at our section on policy and student planning. So we wanted to get a sense of whether or not students are following along with recent policy updates and government announcements. So on our first slide here for this section, we asked students if they had heard of any recent government announcements that might affect international students. And what we see is that a combined 60% of students, so that's the 2 circles on the right of this slide, have either not heard of any recent government announcements or are unsure if they have. So that obviously leaves only 40% of students who say that they are aware of recent government announcements and changes. Now, I think it is worth pointing out again, as Jessica noted at the outset, that this survey was out in the field just before the pause on visa appointments and the travel ban. So I suspect that this awareness level may be higher now that changes have been implemented that more directly affect international students. Now, on this next slide here, we are looking at that same question about awareness of recent government announcements, but broken down by source country. So here, taking a look at this, we see that India, China, and Kenya had the highest level of students who reported that they were aware of recent government announcements. So those are the percentages in the green there. But interestingly, China also had the highest proportion of students who said they did not have awareness. Now, this could be because of the Great Firewall in China. Students maybe have less access to information and news updates, perhaps, but it is interesting to see those numbers nonetheless. On our next slide, to delve in further into the effects of recent policy changes, we asked students, do you expect new government policies, for example, tariffs, cost of living changes, visa changes, to affect your study plans? And students here could respond yes positively, yes negatively, no or not sure. So we can see the most selected option here was yes negatively. So over a third of students do expect that recent policies and announcements will have a negative effect on their study experience. Now, when we combine that with the 24% of students next to it who are not sure, that is a hefty combined 58% of students who either have uncertainty or expect negative impacts of this administration on their study experience. Another source market breakdown here, and this is on that same last question, asking students about if they expect negative or positive changes. And I want to call your attention here to the fact that China is once again the standout country. So 55% of Chinese students expect to be negatively impacted by recent government policies, such as tariffs, changes to the cost of living, visa changes, and so on. And this was the highest proportion of any source country, as we can see. We also asked students, how confident are you in the overall stability of the US environment, including political leadership and economic conditions, over the next 2 years? Now, despite some of the concerns that we saw come through on the previous slides, nearly half of respondents to this survey say that they have high confidence in US political and economic stability over the next 2 years. And then we see 30% reporting low confidence, and the remaining 20% there somewhere in the middle. So we'll again take a look at that question, but by source country on our next slide. And here we see that confidence is highest among Kenyans and Nigerians. And again, not surprisingly, we see China really being the standout here again. So nearly 60% of Chinese students say that they have low confidence in US political and economic stability over the next 2 years, where we obviously see much more confidence among Kenyans, Nigerians, and even Pakistani and Bangladeshi students as well. So next, we're going to dive a bit deeper into those student concerns. And we asked how concerned students feel about possible changes to visa conditions or work rights, such as OPT and CPT, under the new administration. And a combined 87% of respondents expressed concern about possible changes to visa conditions or work rights. So nearly every student in this survey who is looking to study in the US is concerned about visa and work right changes. We see only 13% saying that they have no concerns at all around these issues. So quite a significant number there. We then asked students, how likely are you to consider switching to another destination based on recent US developments? So we can see here that close to half of prospective students report that they have a high likelihood to switch to a different destination. That is the 44% on the left. Well, just under a third of students say that they have low likelihood to go to a different destination. So these students are more committed to studying in the US. And again, we will look at another source country breakdown here on those students who report being likely to switch destinations. So here we see that Pakistan, Nepal, and China report the highest likelihood to switch, while Kenya and Nigeria report the lowest likelihood to switch. Now, you'll recall from a few slides ago that Kenya and Nigeria were also the countries that reported having the highest confidence in the US's economic and political stability over the next 2 years. So we are really seeing a confidence in the US among these two African countries that we are not quite seeing elsewhere in these other source countries. Okay, so I just shared a ton of data with you. Thank you for sticking with me through those. I will now pass it back over to Jessica. We will open it up to any Q&A, and then we will transition into our panel discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ellie. And Ellie, if I could invite you to stay on just for a moment, I think I'm going to hit you with one question. It's an easy one for you, I think.
Okay.
But I want to reiterate what you said about our Q&A being open. So folks that are watching, please feel free to drop your questions in. And at the same time, I'd like to invite our panel experts, Beth and Kalpin, to turn their cameras on and join us while we get our discussion started, which I'm really excited about. Ellie, I wanted to start with you because I think that you shared with us that there's been a shift, a downward shift in perceptions of the United States from the last time we conducted a survey in February. But what surprised, I think, the field then is still a little bit surprising, which is what you emphasized, that many students, still in the 40 to 50% range between the two surveys, indicated that their perceptions of the United States had improved as a result of Donald Trump taking office. And I think that many of us in the field of international education find that surprising because we're experiencing those pressures, that negative pressure on higher education. And so it feels like a disconnect to us, which is, by the way, one of the reasons these types of surveys are so important, because it connects us with our audience. But I know that you have had a chance to look at the free text responses. These are the boxes where students can just write free form their comments. And we haven't showed those today, but I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on what students are saying as they explain the reasons for their perceptions.
Absolutely. Excellent question. And I just want to say I also share in that same kind of surprise and difficulty in understanding some of the ways that students respond to these questions. So I share that same sentiment with the sector, but it is very revealing once we dive into these free text responses to see what different students from different countries are saying about why they responded the way they did. And what we have seen a lot of is that students from countries that may have more authoritative governments themselves, such as India and Pakistan, are saying this is a great change for the US. The US needed a strong leader. Trump will be friends with Modi, and it will bode well for India's relationship with the US. We also saw a lot of students saying, I'm someone who wants to immigrate the right way and do things legally. And I appreciate that Trump places a lot of importance on that as well. So we see some really interesting interpretations of the new administration and a lot of international students who are doubling down on their desire to come to the US. As you touched on earlier, Jessica, there is also kind of that, the fact that it is a short-term desire. These represent students who are maybe a bit further in the funnel and are a bit more committed to coming and studying in the US. So I think we see that reflected in their responses as well.
Thank you so much, Ellie, for letting me put you on the spot. Emma, if you want to bring down the slide, I'd like to invite Kalpin and Beth into the conversation now. And Beth, I think we'll start with you, but I know that we shared these results with you ahead of today. And I'm curious what stood out to you initially, and were there any surprises in these findings for you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Delighted to be here. Such a fascinating topic, and it feels I was sort of doing some cramming even before coming onto this call because it feels like the news is changing so quickly. And in fact, on that note, check out the Pi News tomorrow. It does look like there's been a shift in some of the policies on Chinese students. So yeah, I am surprised. I think just to echo what's already been said, it is interesting that students are not as turned off by some of these policies as I think has been the real fear from a lot of stakeholders in the US. And actually, I think that's quite reassuring. I hope it's reassuring for stakeholders because I think there's always the temptation, isn't there, when so much changes so quickly for panic to set in, and actually calm, collected, thinking about how best to respond in a cool, calm and collected way is always going to be the best result rather than panicking and doing anything too rash. I would say as well, so something that we discussed when we were chatting backstage about this is the age of some of these respondents and how that trickles down into, so I wonder if maybe Ellie or Jessica wants to talk about that, just how that affects people's judgment on and where they want to, or how they perceive what's happening in the US.
Yeah, thanks so much, Beth. And I do see we had a question about the breakdown of undergrad versus grad. That is featured, that was in an earlier slide, and that'll be in the follow-up email. It's a relatively even, but a little skewed towards the graduate studies in this particular survey. But again, we'll share that back again. And then Beth, the other thing, just responding to your thoughts, something that I've often said in recent webinars for those that have tuned into these through IDP is I think one of the takeaways I have with this data is that students don't necessarily see US politics as relevant to them, except when it is. And so it's like the changing of an administration maybe doesn't impact them as much as we think about it because they're not paying attention to how the sausage is made and the policy impact. But then when we see, a student visa appointment pause, like Ellie said, it hits them directly, and that's where things start to change. But I'd like to turn it over to you, Kalpin, and same question. I know you've seen these results you've had these results in hand even longer than Beth, as I know. What stood out to you, and what surprises, if any?
Thanks. So delighted to be here and share some thoughts and really sort of learn from this Q&A. I have had some time to ponder over these numbers. And I think the one thing that overall stands out to me is that, to underscore, Jessica, what you just said, is that I think students think very differently from those of us that are on the inside of it, in the sector, right? We're thinking of it from certain very existential points of view, right? How does this policy affect overall funding, whether it's in the research space, whether it's in recruitment? How is this going to affect universities' ability to maintain a talent pipeline? Students are not thinking in those terms, right? They're thinking very much in terms of, am I going to be able to go to this country, do this program, do this degree, and what are my outcomes going to be? And in that sense, I think, it's really, to me, it's salutary to think back in micro terms rather than the macro terms that some of us tend to live in. And so I'll highlight one of the sort of top line things that you started out with, and that was the high confidence in the economic and political stability, the 2-year out, right? That was almost at a 50%. I think the slide was a 49% big green bubble. And I think in terms of that medium term top of the funnel, that's good news. I think that is not something that I would expect to see, given, again, what we perceive as a lot of turmoil in terms of the politics and the instability of the politics and the instability of sort of policies, whether they're public policies or foreign affairs, tariffs, visas, negotiations. The other, and a couple of other things that were both sort of surprising / interesting to me. This picks up one of the points that Ellie made about the more discursive comments around students, particularly from some countries, may perceive the current administration more favorably than others. And in that sense, I was actually quite surprised to see that while India's numbers are largely positive, they are lower than I would have expected to see, simply because I think that India has actually not been one of the countries that's been singled out by the current administration for any kind of adverse action. There haven't been negative pronouncements against India. There haven't been any kind of big rhetorical posturings about students coming, from India or not. I think with the exception of that one, certainly in India, and I'm now thinking again very much at the micro level, highly publicized deportation flight early in the spring. I think this might have been between your January, February, and May surveys, but I know that it made a lot of ripples in India, that might have had some effect on that downturn, even though largely positive. And then the other thing that I just don't know how to understand, which I found really puzzling, was why the negative perception has risen higher, or the positive perception has fallen faster, depending on how you want to look at it, among men rather than women. When in fact, again, when you look at it from our perspective, from the US side, from the internal side, we sort of, many of the policies could be seen as being quite regressive and inimical to gender equality, gender rights. And so that's to me something that stood out as something I'd like to dig into or think a little bit more about.
Well, thank you both. And you both started to answer this a little bit, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about how, what you're hearing with student audiences and student populations that you interface with. And this will probably, rely more on you, Kalpin, but Beth, perhaps through some of your reporting as well. And then a specific question that came in from the audience asking about the strong positive responses from Nigeria and Kenya, and just, curious if you have any insights or guesses about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, again, this goes back to what are we seeing directly from students and what does the data show us, right? So one of the things that we've been looking at very carefully, and we've been tracking this since the pandemic as means of predicting enrollment, yield, melt, et cetera, is, we look very carefully, especially at this time of year, on a week-by-week basis, at our student visa numbers, at the number of students who have triggered their I-901 payments. So this is a little bit of inside CVIS baseball, but when a student chooses their I-20 for your institution, they make an I-901 payment, which is generally for us a good indicator of their yield to campus. And when we look at those kinds of numbers, we're still tracking fairly well with previous years, and we have historical data, so we can go week by week in 2024 or 2023 or 2022. And so I think, again, while there is a lot of churn and conversation out there, what we're hearing from students and what we're seeing from students is that they want to come and be part of our programs if we can, if we can make that happen, and if they can make that happen, and recognizing that a lot of this is out of our control. And so I think we've been very intentional about how we've communicated with these groups of students to say that even with things like the visa pause, for instance, we are hearing, as I'm sure many of the folks in the audience are, that some posts are keeping visa appointments going, or new appointments are being made available. And so I think our message to students very much is, we want you here. Look on your consular websites, get the first visa appointment you can. Student visas are prioritized by previous administration policy, which has not been rescinded by the current administration. So I think that kind of positive reinforcement is very much the space where we are right now. I do worry, though, about the high rates both of visa refusal in Africa. So the Kenya and the Nigeria figures feel to me like they could be soft if, especially as was reported over the weekend, Nigeria could be added to the travel ban. This was in a Washington Post report over the weekend. So I think those are just some things to watch and be in touch with the students on the ground.
Yeah, I think really fascinating insights there, Kalpin. So we do have a strong presence amongst international students and prospective international students, which is a lovely insight into what we will do this for and why it's so important. So I think crucially, the main ways that we will speak to them is if something has happened that is affecting them, we will try and get in touch with international students and get their impact. So a key example of that was what's happening at Harvard, and some really strong comments from the students there, just about how it's affecting them, their worries, but that they're very pleased that Harvard's standing up for them. They trust Harvard to have their back, I think was one of the quotes. But we do also get comments underneath our stories. A lot of those that come in, and this isn't singling out the US, this is for often a lot of the big markets, we will get a lot of comments about, I want to get a visa appointment, how do I get a visa appointment? Or how do I come and study here? I want to go and do this. And people trying to seek advice from us, so almost trying to use us as a sort of immigration advisory service. So that to me shows that the appetite is still strong. I would also say, looking at the stats that we've had for this month, so some of the most popular stories have been, by far and away, the most popular one this month has been about we were promised a potential lift on the visa freeze a couple of weeks ago. There's limited, to say the least, information about that. And I think as frustration grows among students about that, we have still seen people pouring in, which again indicates that interest in coming to study in the US is still high. What I would also say is that the second most popular story of this month is about international students increasingly turning to the UK in light of what's happening to the US, in the US. So that to me suggests that people are looking at other options as well, which is not to say that it means they no longer want to go to the US, but it may be that people who are quite far down the funnel, as you guys were calling it earlier, might be thinking, okay, well, what's my contingency plan? So overall, I do think appetite is very, very strong, but I do think students are having to be sensible and weigh up what they can do if, for whatever reason, they're not able to get the visa that they need.
Yeah, thank you, Beth and Kalpin. I think, one of the takeaways for me looking at the data and hearing both of your insights is that the impact is going to land differently for different segments of our audiences. We can see the regional differences. There's been some discussion in the Q&A about undergrad versus grad, or postgrad as we sometimes refer to it. And we can understand that for postgraduate students with a shorter runway and more emphasis on ROI, that these changes, especially around threats to OPT and post-study work programs, might be very impactful. We talked about gender identification and the impact that we've seen there. A question in the chat from Clay Hensley is around parent perception, and specifically he asks if we plan to do parent surveys. It is something we've discussed at IDP. It's a little bit more, a little bit unwieldy, a little harder for us to pursue. But I'll just say a word or two about what we're hearing from within our counseling networks, and then I'd love, Beth and Kalpin, if you have thoughts or insights about parent involvement. First, it probably goes without saying that parent involvement is more of a critical issue with our undergrads, less so than our postgrad and graduate students. But what I will say we hold regular meetings with our counseling office managers, if you will, to put it in layperson's terms outside of IDP. And what I'm struck by in those conversations is just how different the perceptions are in those different regions. And so, as an example, in Vietnam, what we hear from our team there is that, perceptions of the United States have been quite durable. And the perceptions of students and parents have largely been that they don't view the changes in the US as relevant to them, and particularly thinking about CVIS terminations and the social media vetting, that they perceive that as relevant to those who maybe stir up trouble or who are involved in activism, and that they don't have a culture of activism. And so they're quite confident that their children are on the right path. And so we hear that in a very, very strongly worded way. Whereas in places like China and increasingly in India, we're seeing, parent concerns around safety and around, reaching those successful outcomes those concerns are on the rise. So that's anecdotal. That's what we're hearing within our network. Love to hear from the two of you on the question of parent perceptions and how that may or may not differ from the student data.
Well, I can only go off guesses. And again, off some of the comments that come through on our website, and some of those are from parents. That's again very much not limited to what's happening in the US, but it tends to be when there's been a big policy shift in one of the big four markets. So last year, when everything was happening in Canada, and that's what our news team had to really focus on, rather than now everyone all hands on deck for all things Trump. That you do tend to get an influx of comments from parents saying questions, how can my son or daughter do this? What does this look like? Or even just, I think kind of spilling their guts a little bit and just wanting a forum to share their concerns, thoughts and feelings and have that engaged with in a sympathetic way. What I would suggest, and again, this is just a hunch, is that I would say parents are probably more likely to have negative perceptions overall than the students themselves. I think that is generally an age thing, because I suspect that you would also see that split, undergraduate versus postgraduate, just because who among us, I'm a professional journalist, I was not reading the newspaper cover to cover, even then, to my shame. So I would very much doubt that, and had other things to be thinking about, like, when is my next party going to be, and when was I going to be able to go out with my friends? So while I'm sure that a lot of young people are politically engaged, it may be that, again, we're all too close to this and we all see these policies coming. And to an extent, we do have to think that way. We do have to safeguard and future-proof and think, okay, well, how is this going to affect us? How can we try and navigate this and get ahead of all these problems? But it is what it is. And it's not a US story, but for example, in the UK, when there's been this really controversial policy where VAT fees have been added to private schools. Sorry, a VAT tax has been added to private school fees. So that is, in effect, rising private school fees. I went to a conference last year of independent boarding schools in the UK, and there were loads of agents there from all around the world. And it was really interesting because, of course, from these boarding schools' perspective, it's all they could think about, all they could talk about. It was the big news of the time. And this fabulous, really direct agent said, I'm speaking to parents in Eastern Europe all the time, and kind of, you guys got to get over yourself, because as far as they're concerned, they're not reading the headlines in the UK in the same way that you are. The price is the price, and they will just go with what they can afford. And I suspect something similar would be true in the US. If a parent or their child has their heart set on going into the US, they will find a way to do it. So again, there is definitely hope.
Yeah, I think I'll just echo some of the things that Beth and Jessica that you shared. And I don't talk to parents a lot, but when I do talk to parents, it's always interesting to me that the questions and comments really sort of fall down into the ROI bucket, right? I mean, they are concerned about safety, and we get questions about it before times, or I guess priorly, so about gun safety and gun laws in the US. And I think shootings always make a big impression, but mostly they're concerned about what's the job situation going to be like on graduation? Will they get an internship? Do you have support for internships? Will your career advising? Those are the kinds of things that parents really tend to drill down into. More recently, though, and this is very anecdotal and impressionistic, but I've been struck by, again, this is how we perceive things within our sphere and within our space. Certainly those of us that are in the so-called blue states in the United States sometimes, congratulate ourselves being able to potentially offer a more welcoming and a more friendly atmosphere and campuses and policies towards international students. But I've heard now on more than one occasion from parents that this is both in India and in Vietnam. It's like, why do we only ever hear about protests and riots in the Northeast? Would it not be safer for my child to go to a school in the South or the Midwest? And so I think, again, what we might within ourselves consider to be maybe more unfriendly territories towards international students, I think some of those things are actually perceived positively, Jessica, to what you were saying. So it's always, getting out of one's headspace, difficult as it is important. And data like this really shows us that we should do that more often than not.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kalpin. And that sort of segues into a question that I had, and also that came through as an audience question from Kaori. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Kaori Nakama. Which is, if you're in charge of a recruitment strategy, an international student recruitment strategy for a US university, what are your takeaways? How do you absorb and adapt according to this data and just the shifting landscape that we're in? A very challenging question, but just, would love any insights that you might have.
I mean, so I will say this, there was a recent Quinnipiac poll, in fact, just last week, which showed that among registered voters in the United States, 74% said international students were a good thing for the US, right? I mean, when you break it down, I think that the numbers are telling. It's 49% of Republicans and 96% of Democrats. So the truth, as always, lies somewhere in between in the US. But by and large, I think international students still are very much wanted in this country. I think they're essential to our research and development and talent pipelines. I think the US's primacy in these areas in research and innovation is, I think, would really fall down upon itself without the best and the brightest coming to us. And so I think for us to be able to build those really solid connections with students, with families, with parents, with our, if we are using IDP or others, to make sure that those networks can really talk about your campus, your programs, lean into that perception of excellence, of the high quality of US educational programs, and then make sure that you're on top of those interventions and communications as and when needed to show that your students are important to you. I think the PI reported just yesterday, or was it the day before, on the new IIE brief 2030 about, again, how important international students are to the US research pipeline and talent pipeline. So I think we've got a lot of data. The important thing is not to rest on our laurels. And really, when you're thinking about recruitment and when you're thinking about your strategies, this is the time to do a lot more in terms of early intervention at the top of the funnel. Because once you get students going in there and you make them realize that certain things are going to be out of anyone's control, you show that you want them on your campus and you're going to do the best you can to get them there.
Thank you so
I
much.
completely
Cal.
agree.
Oh, sorry, Beth, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, I completely agree. I think you covered so much there. I have a couple more points to make. So I think a lot of it we covered, you know, that balance between being prepared for as many eventualities as you can, but also try to stay objective. I think the important thing to remember as well is a lot of this is likely to be temporary, whether that's because at some point, the likelihood is that there will be an administration change after however many years, if it's after this term, after next term, whatever. But also to remember that the administration that we have, I think regardless of your political views, it's very fair objectively to say that this administration is pretty fickle. So one of Trump's almost policies is, it was a promise that he made, a throwaway remark on a podcast before the election. He would offer green cards to every every international graduate in the US, which at the moment looks like it won't come to pass, but who knows? We just don't know with him. So I think that's really important as well. So just kind of take it as it comes as much as you can. I know it's really difficult when people are really stressed. I would also say make noise because it can make a difference. So if you notice any small policy shift, especially because a lot of it gets buried on departmental websites, let the press know, let us know. We've done stuff with that. So there was a big policy shift in part due to some of our reporting last year. And that was all because one of our readers had noticed that there was this little policy shift that buried away in a government website. We called out the government for it. Other people led the charge in that as well. And we changed that within a month. That can happen. So it almost sounds contradictory. Don't pay too much attention to it, but also pay a lot of attention to it. But I think it's a very nuanced situation, and therefore the response needs to be nuanced as well.
Yeah, thank you both. And as we're reaching the end of our time, I thought this was a good place to conclude. You mentioned Beth making noise, and I think that kind of brings us full circle as to the importance of working collectively as a field right now. And I mentioned at the top that, you know, as a company, IDP aims to provide data and share knowledge so that we can work together as a field. We work in close collaboration, not only with institutions as clients and partners, but also with stakeholder associations. Myself, outside of my IDP role, I co-chair the Higher Education Engagement Committee of the U.S. for Success Coalition. Don't try to say that twice. That's a mouthful. I'm going to drop the link in the chat for institutions that are not already part of it. This is an amazing time to lean into partners and associations right now. We are the ones that are able to speak sometimes when institutions cannot. And it's an important time to stay plugged in. We will be sharing insights. Our associations are sharing insights. The PIE is reporting, and we now got a scoop that there will be an update tomorrow on China, which I'm a little nervous about. But these are all important ways to stay plugged in, and also to stay inspired, to remember why we do what we do, and to lift each other up, because there are some tough days here. I think I speak for all of us when we've had days where we've had to dig deep. But this work is important. We are transforming lives. We're supporting students on their journey, and that's what gets me up in the morning. So I think that's something that we all share. So I think that's a good place to conclude. Thank you so much, Kalpin and Beth, for being here. Again, for those of you that joined us late, we did record this session. We will be sending a follow-up email with the survey results and the slides that we shared today. And I did mention at the top that we do aim to conduct student perception surveys on a quarterly basis. Someone asked me to get specific about what that date is going to be. I do not have that yet. Laura asked a question about how do we know if our institution has already joined. I believe, Laura, that there's a list on that website, but if not, you should be able to send an email, and Jill Welch, who's the principal of the organization, should be able to confirm one way or the other. But again, we will have more survey data coming in the near future. I will certainly keep everybody informed, and we'll be out on LinkedIn and in your inboxes with that data as soon as it lands. So thank you again for being here, and wish everyone a wonderful remainder to their day. Thank you so much.